My clock says 6:05, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started, and other people can filter in here. As Anulia asked in the chat, we're hoping to record these and post them if it's okay with our speakers. So, hopefully the people who registered but aren't able to actually make it today will be able to catch up on some of this material. But welcome, everyone. Welcome to Delivery Exception. This is a speaker series that we've organized for this spring with the goal of bringing together scholars and organizers to discuss the theme of logistical justice in a kind of broad sense, and hopefully to examine the possibilities of reconciliation in our current era of supply chain capitalism. And really the motivation for this series is to think about questions of, environmental justice, social justice around the supply chain. The supply chain has problems, right? There's always a problem with the supply chain. Sometimes that problem is that something doesn't arrive quite when you expect it. Sometimes that problem is that there's a global pandemic that has, shut down ports everywhere. Sometimes that problem is environmental degradation. Sometimes it's child labor or slave labor in the supply chain. And obviously, those problems are not necessarily all the same. But what is certain and what unites them all is that the supply chain is the object that is sort of orchestrating all of these unique and terrible problems. So we have a range of speakers, and I'll go through the schedule in just a minute, who are going to talk about different topics. Tamara Kneese today is going to talk about AI and the AI supply chain. We have people later on who are going to talk about ports and port labor, or Amazon as this, massive logistical enterprise. We have people who are going to talk about oil, the sort of, software of logistics systems like SAP, and people who are going to talk about organizing and what workers can do when they find themselves enrolled in the supply chain and in potentially an unjust supply chain. So quite a range of topics, and we hope it's going to be an exciting series of short talks where people are going to engage with this theme. So I have some credits, I guess, that I need to read through, acknowledgments and funding, things like that. This event series is free and open to the public. It's organized as part of the Supply Studies Research Network, which is a group of scholars, students, activists, and organizers who have identified an active interest in the critical study of logistics. And that research network is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities Office of Digital Humanities. Funding and additional support for this series in particular is provided by the Conference of Arts and Science Deans at Fordham and the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Fordham. I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Matthew Hockenberry. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham. While as a virtual event, the geographies that have been enrolled in our gathering here today are many. I would also like to acknowledge that Fordham itself occupies the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape and Wappinger peoples. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd also like to give you a little preview of the rest of the events we have planned over the spring here. So our next event, which is Thursday, February 8th at noon Eastern Time, we're going to be hosting Jess Beer and Jessica Steinman from Erasmus University Rotterdam. On Wednesday, February 21st at noon, we have Armin Beverangen, Maya Lee Vogt, and Ulf Traeger from Leuphana University Lundberg. On Wednesday, March 6th at 7 p.m., we have Christina Dunbar-Hester from the University of Southern California, and Athena Tan from Plugin IE, where the IE there stands for Inland Empire. On Monday, March 18th at 6 p.m., we have Miriam Posner, who's at UCLA. And last but not least, on Wednesday, March 27th at 6 p.m., we have our final event featuring Benjamin McKean, who's at Ohio State University, Jessica Champagne, who's at the Workers' Rights Consortium, and Angelis Solis, with Make the Road Action. Each of those events, I'm very much looking forward to, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for some of them. Our speaker today, though, talking about AI supply chains, infrastructures, workflows, and power, is Tamara Kneese. Tamara Kneese is the project director of Data and Society's Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab. Before joining Data and Society, she was the lead researcher at Green Software Foundation, director of developer engagement on the Green Software team at Intel, and assistant professor of media studies and director of gender and sexuality studies at the University of San Francisco. Tamara holds a PhD in media culture and communication from NYU and is the author of the recently released Death Glitch: How Techno-Solutionism Fails Us in This Life and Beyond. And while she's not talking about that book today, I'm sure she would answer some questions in the Q&A, which we'll hold after Tamara's presentation. So Tamara, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for that introduction. And I have to say, it's actually very refreshing to not be giving a book talk right now. So I'm excited to talk about this other work and the supply chain. So how is that looking? You know what? I think I'm gonna put my camera off while I'm talking, just to yeah. Let's see. I don't know. I guess it's fine. It's fine. I'm gonna leave it. I'm gonna go for it. Okay. Well, thank you again for this invite. It's such a wonderful collection of talks for this speaker series on supply chain justice. So thank you all for joining us here today. I'm speaking to you from unceded Ohlone territory. I'm in Oakland, California. And I'm really excited to share this paper because it is part of a newer body of work that I've been developing, kind of based in part on my experiences working on sustainability product teams and in sort of various tech for good spaces in a variety of different ways. And I have a new kind of nascent book project that is forming that is about the different waves of social scientists and other researchers who have entered the tech industry in an attempt to both understand and transform it. How are Silicon Valley ideologies reproduced and also challenged through technological development? And do terms like AI, data center, compute, or hell, even supply chains, obscuring disparities in forms of labor and extraction? What does it mean to visualize and make graspable a set of relations over time? To quote the introduction to assembly codes, of which, of course, Dr. Hockenberry is one of the editors, to unpack the logistical imagination is to trace the representational and imaginative modes of logistical activity, as well as the aesthetic and performative practices that have emerged to grapple with logistical transformations. Today, I'll be focusing on the climate and labor impacts of AI, trying to make sense of how workers within tech companies view the supply chain and how that often very narrow view might be broadened. So I'm going to start by going through some of the ways that other scholars have framed or tried to render visible the AI supply chain. So very recently, well, I guess not that recently now, it was back in September. I have no sense of time anymore. For AI Now, Jai Vipra and Sarah Myers-West peeled back the layers on the GPUs needed for large-scale AI. They contextualized the rise of NVIDIA, which has really started to dominate the sort of AI scene. And I should also mention that the power that I used in my subtitle has a dual meaning. So I'm interested in both the energy consumption and compute, that are required for scaling AI. But I'm also really interested in the sort of power relations behind that compute. So what does it mean when only a few companies, a handful of corporations, really have the control over the compute needed to train large-scale AI? And of course, in addition to the sort of chip design and fabrication side of the supply chain, we also have data centers at the center of AI's environmental impacts. And Dustin Edwards, Zane Cooper, and Mel Hogan just put out a really critical article defining data center studies and data centers' relationship to colonialist extraction and global supply chains. The image here comes from Mel Hogan's prompt, Humans and Data Centers at the End of the World, using OpenAI's DALL-E. And I love it just because for once, we actually do see an imagined data center worker, not just the sort of standard stock photos of data centers that we tend to kind of associate with them. And speaking of data infrastructures, I actually had to use a screenshot from Lou Szilard, another AI researcher, from his website, because Mel's original tweet was no longer available when I went to search for it. So data centers are obviously sources of power in many different ways, and they suck up a lot of energy. They also require massive amounts of water for on-site server cooling and off-site electricity generation. And resource-intensive data centers affect different parts of the world differently. Putting a data center in a drought-stricken area can, of course, be detrimental to the people, other species, and habitats in that area. In another recent sort of visualization of the AI supply chain, Anna Valdi tweeted this really incredible kind of mapping of the global networks of labor and materials that go into AI. And this is from a project that she's been working on in 4 months of fieldwork. So thinking about the kind of intensive forms of research that go into actually trying to situate the global supply chain, and sort of going beyond just the kind of recognition through visualization alone. But of course, the true impacts of AI production is connected to all of these different sites, from cobalt miners and Foxconn manufacturing workers or underpaid data workers in Kenya, or e-waste labor and caste politics in India. And so just thinking about all of the different places in the world and all of the different kinds of work that are sort of constitutive of AI. And many of the problems that are part of the AI boom, of course, were also part of the crypto hype cycle before it, and the ICT industry as a whole, or capitalism as a whole, perhaps as well. So Lisa Nakamura has written about the transnational circuits of the iPhone, where the image of an iPhone worker at a Foxconn factory sort of gave people a glimpse of the manufacturing workers behind their devices, just a little sort of peek behind the screen of a form of labor that is often obscured in the marketing of Apple products. And if you think about how many articles many of us have likely at this point read about the conditions of child laborers in the Congo, or other forms of extractive labor practices that have to do with the ICT industry. Thea Riofrancos has told us about the extractive labor practices that allow for the production of lithium batteries for EVs that will supposedly save us from climate doom, replacing fossil fuel dependent cars with zero emission ones instead of investing in public transit or other car-free options. And so again, we are just sort of coming up with a techno solution to the problem of climate change rather than asking people to modify their habits in any way or to think about how we might build public infrastructures differently. And within tech companies, you see a different kind of visualization of sort of the infrastructures or energy infrastructures in particular behind AI. And so this is a very popular one among the sort of sustainability software and hardware practitioners that I encounter at places like Green Software Foundation. So Electricity Maps provides you with real-time updates on the renewable energy or other sources available on the grid in any point in time in a variety of different geographic locations. And so the idea is that as a developer, you can make informed choices about what you're doing and when based on what the grid looks like. And so data kind of can empower individual developers to make better choices that will be greener in nature. And generally speaking, in these tech circles, there's a tendency to focus on, calculating, measuring, and reporting greenhouse gas emissions without really thinking about other factors. And so things like circularity or the effects of e-waste, that is not really usually part of the conversation. And carbon in particular becomes a kind of problematic point of focus just because carbon offsets are also another place where financialization and exploitation can lead to the gaming of the system, where basically carbon offsets are used to justify colonialism in the Amazon in the name of regenerative finance. And for tech companies overall, generally speaking, the search for perfect data or just the act of measurement itself is the end of the story, which often fails to translate into any sort of meaningful structural change. And as I will return to later in this talk, it's hard to hold the entire supply chain at once. In tech companies, workers are often focused on one product or one division. So how do you consider the ramifications of your design decisions on something you cannot see or grasp? As David Gray-Witter and Don Nafis observe in their paper about AI ethics in the supply chain, a convoluted global supply chain can cloud developers' sense of agency and responsibility. And basically what happens is that within these organizations, an ethics checklist will basically pop up and, legal will give you the okay and just be like, ship it. And that's about the end of the story. There's not really a deeper consideration of, what are we building and why are we building it? And the momentum is really sort of behind the shipping of the product, not the assessment of whether or not it should be produced in the first place, or how it might be designed in a better way. And so for management, worrying about the environmental impact of AI or other technologies generally ends at energy efficiency or anything else that can actually be tied to cost effectiveness rather than a true commitment to changing the status quo. So something that we kind of have been talking about probably a lot in the general world of kind of AI research is the state of responsible AI. And one might wonder, what is responsible AI? And, in what way does responsible AI, or however we might define it, trustworthy AI, ethical AI, any number of different forms of AI, how might they sort of begin to help us see a supply chain? Is there any relationship between sort of making sense of AI practitioners within giant corporate organizations and an attempt to bring more of a sense of social or environmental justice to the tech supply chain? And, I'm really approaching this project as someone who has been always fascinated by the various ethnographers and other researchers, people like STS scholar Lucy Suchman, who joined Xerox PARC in 1979. So all these different waves of people who entered the tech workforce as participant observers, pushing for human-centered design and advocating for users and participants. And so the folks who end up on responsible AI teams don't always fall into this category, but there are a large number of people who are trained social scientists, many of whom are ethnographers in some way, who are kind of using their research skills and their desire to be advocates to position themselves within tech companies in order to affect some kind of change from within. And so much of the fraught relationship between corporate production and humanistic critique is what we're seeing play out right now with mass layoffs, companies cutting ethics teams. At the very same time, they are quickly shipping generative AI products without any oversight. And for many companies, ethics is, of course, mostly tied to regulation and compliance. So again, the checkbox for legal is really sort of the most important aspect of sort of ethical oversight. There's also the matter of the gendered, racialized labor of the critics within tech. And this is very much tied to cultures and histories of volunteerism within sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion movements in the tech industry and sort of corporate structures as a whole. And what I'm really grappling with here is the ongoing tension between positioning oneself as a perpetual outsider while also trying to navigate the internal bureaucracies and quantifiable metrics of the enterprise, and the tension between the singular ethnographer figure in the field of their own workplace versus the collective action through internal and external organizing and coalition building that we also do sometimes see within these organizations and beyond. So backing up a little bit and talking about sort of the history behind some of the forms of collective action that we see in the tech movement today, and also in a couple of slides from now, I will also talk a little bit more about sort of the history of this sort of larger notion of responsible AI, responsible tech, and where it comes from. So employee resource groups, or ERGs, are essentially employee-led affinity groups within organizations. They started during the civil rights era in the 1960s. The National Black Employees Caucus at Xerox was founded in 1970. And then HP founded Glenn, their group for LGBTQ employees, in 1978. And ERGs typically are created for workers from specific racial groups. Many have identity-based groups for workers. So, there are often groups for Black or Latinx employees, women employees, sometimes employee groups for things that are more based on a kind of passion, like sustainability is one of a sort of handful of newer ERGs that are more focused on a kind of a justice orientation that is sort of beyond identity alone. But that's sort of the sort of thing that you see. Occasionally, you also do see ERGs for like parents and such, and other groups of workers who might have common interests. But according to McKinsey, of course, we should always believe them, ERGs help foster DEI initiatives and may help with retention and well-being. And so there's this like weird argument that sort of by allowing employees to form these employee resource groups, it will actually help the corporation in some way because employees will be happier, they'll be around people that they, have something in common with, and they'll, advocate for maybe some policy changes within the organization, but it's a way to kind of focus on things like retention and also by extension productivity. So there are all these sort of arguments that ERGs kind of help foster innovation within companies and that they also keep employees happier and more productive. So even though ERGs actually can offer space for critical conversations, as I found even during my own experience as part of Intel's Out and Ally Leadership Council for LGBTQ employees, where we had members sort of learning about healthcare benefits within the company, or sort of having larger conversations about the history of queer computing. These groups are led by volunteers and do not always have executive level support. And so as a former Airbnb employee who wrote a post for Tech Workers Coalition for our newsletter, while he threw himself into employee resource groups activities as a way of finding community, he found that such initiatives really relied on unpaid labor and that they seemed especially time-consuming for his Black women colleagues. As he puts it, I couldn't fathom the drain from microaggressions, code switching, and gatekeeping, which cut across the product orgs too. And so thinking about asking employees who are already in marginalized positions to take on additional volunteer labor is, quite a big ask and something that, could potentially be quite draining. But clearly ERGs actually do have some sort of value for the organization. And so I find it interesting that HP on their own website today, they have this article about how to start an employee resource group. And the article is actually from 1995, but there's this sense that by sort of allowing space for these forms of collective action within the organization, you are, you're kind of preventing people from, forming a union or from doing any sort of real organizing work. And so there's a safety to it at the same time that, obviously, these groups actually can seed more sort of justice-oriented conversations within an org or about larger social issues, which I'll talk about a little bit later too. So pivoting over to another acronym that is very common in the corporate landscape is ESG. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance disclosure at companies. And so this is another sort of origin story for thinking about responsible AI and where that is sort of coming from. And so in the 1960s, again, there was sort of a wave of investors who were more concerned with social responsibility. And so there were people who were actually advocating for anti-apartheid divestment from South Africa and other sort of trade union related investments. And so there was a sense that you could use your money in a socially responsible way. And the term ESG first appeared in a 2004 UN report. And so a lot of this also becomes entwined with the sort of the UN goals for sustainable development. And so there's this sense that, you're kind of ranking companies according to how well they're doing with things like gender parity and how well they're doing with sustainability. So the whole idea that you're kind of evaluating how responsibly corporations are behaving is sort of deriving from this particular set of terms and a set of concepts. And basically, it also has become a very common source of kind of vetting potential products within the tech industry. So corporate responsibility people, ESG strategists, they're kind of determining what policy changes or regulatory changes might be on the horizon regarding human rights, regarding the environment, and what might product managers and people who are designing the products really have to know about what they're putting out there in order to maintain, their veneer at least of, social responsibility. And so obviously this is a place right now where, climate has become a really big part of these discussions. And so when we talk about net zero pledges, this is really where you have interesting intersections of kind of grassroots organizing campaigns led by employees who often are maybe started in employee resource groups, and then these larger kind of maybe greenwashing or ethics washing on the part of corporations, where they're kind of creating net zero goals and pledges in order to appear as socially responsible actors. And so, one particular image that I thought was quite amusing was this ad from Salesforce, which was using Matthew McConaughey, the actor. And this is clearly a play on kind of the billionaire space exit. And the ad claims that the new frontier is planet Earth, which will now be more sustainable thanks to companies like Salesforce. And so rather than looking for, colonies on Mars, we should just make this planet better, which, is not a terrible idea, but it's just a very strange ad. But it's useful to think about this rhetoric and imagery in relation to power and its mundane operation in corporate workflows and hierarchies and OKRs, or objectives and key results, for those of you who haven't had to deal with those. And so the people advocating for sustainability and ethics within tech companies, the employees who actually really maybe do care about this, they rarely have very much support or power, and they often are from marginalized communities themselves. And so there's this strange sort of relationship between sort of imagining that, maybe we can make a product, maybe we can make a tool Maybe we can use software. Maybe we can use AI to help the planet, to make sure that we're using AI to properly measure climate impacts. Maybe we can use it to like figure out the most optimal way, to create a website so that we are, emitting less carbon. And so there's this sense that you can always sort of tie decarbonization efforts and sustainability or, sort of responsibility efforts more broadly to a product that will still make the corporation money. But no one ever really bothers to question, does the measurement of emissions actually translate into reduction? And if you do build all of these tools, like even if you have the perfect sort of, AI to, track droughts or for farmers or something, how are you actually going to be sure it's going to be implemented? Like, have you talked to anyone who will actually be using these things that you're creating? And who is your imagined user? And that's a question that comes up a lot within tech companies. And what are the gaps between climate and ethics pledges and corporate priorities, particularly as data centers keep expanding and AI infrastructures require more resources and more compute? So how does that square with this sense that we will be, quote unquote, carbon neutral by X date? So I'm really interested in the tensions between the marketing, corporate responsibility ethics, and greenwashing, and what workers are doing to actually mitigate climate change across the supply chain. And so, certainly we have the problem with sort of, the focus on energy efficiency and a shift to renewable energy is a sort of blank check for endless growth and profit. And so, what I've seen recently, which I do find really interesting, is that technologists who used to be really sold on the idea of carbon-aware computing as sort of the solution to the problem, that if developers just could, train their AI at a time of day when the grid has more renewables available, that like somehow this will save the planet. Now, so a technologist who I know from sort of these green software circles, he recently, Ishmael Velasco, he recently wrote for Hacker Noon that the environmental challenge of computing is not primarily one of energy optimization, but of energy demand. So carbon-aware computing is just in the other form of optimization. So again, like you're not actually changing the nature of the problem at all. You're just sort of creating another quick fix, but that isn't going to ultimately solve the overarching problem, which is that it's a consumption problem overall. Like the problem is endless growth. But what also is interesting to me is that even within these sort of more corporate tech settings, you do find people who are advocating for climate justice approaches to the problem, who are taking a more holistic view of sustainability. And in some cases, they are connecting labor rights to climate goals. So I'm really interested in the incompatibilities and inconsistencies and the points of friction in these worldviews and practices. So one example is from a panel I was on for Mozilla Festival, organized by trustworthy AI senior fellow Bobby Rakova, which was focused on the socio-ecological dimensions of AI transparency. And Bobby has really been pushing for kind of bringing STS methods to technology production in both very obvious ways, like by quoting Anna Singh, but then also in subtle ways as well. And so she really positions friction as something that should not be solved, and rather we should be embracing the messiness of it all and bringing marginalized communities into conversations from the start instead of as an afterthought during user testing, and really thinking about the entire life cycle of AI and, really thinking about sort of the various elements of the supply chain, and then also the need to wind systems down and to think about how they might be disposed of as well, either in e-waste or other forms. But there's always this lurking problem of extraction, even through apparent participation. And so what does it mean for, corporations to say, hey, we're going to bring in all of these people from different civil rights organizations and from, indigenous communities, and we're going to, have engage them in a conversation to make sure that our tech is not so bad. And maybe feed that back into some tweaks to the product design overall. But there's still the sense that, we don't need to fundamentally change anything. We're just going to kind of, do communities the favor of kind of like bringing them in a little bit, right? And so it's a very tricky thing, particularly when the terms of participation are still being set by companies and researchers in the global north. So something that I've found really exciting is looking at histories of coalition building in relation to responsible production. And, there's so much turnover in the tech industry that it can be really hard to kind of share even, tech worker histories from 5 years ago with kind of newer waves of people who might be thinking about organizing in tech workplaces. And so I think it's really crucial for tech workers to know more about these other histories, and perhaps they can ignite new organizing movements and new ways of seeing the tech supply chain as a whole. So that's my hope. So in the 1970s in the UK, manufacturing workers at Lucas Aerospace were threatened by layoffs. And in response, the shop floor workers actually came up with a plan to produce what they called socially useful goods to help the company shift away from producing fighter aircraft components. And they created a plan that was over 200 pages with over 150 different product descriptions, which included things like wind turbines and a battery-driven car. And so it was this sort of, worker-led form of radical R&D that was trying to move the company away from militarism and to think about what would it mean to actually design things that were socially useful. And okay, so the plan was never actualized. So in some ways, you could say it didn't work. But they spread their ideas through teach-ins and through academic collaborations. And so thinking about the importance of, teach-ins and of education and of kind of sharing ideas, I think, that forms a lot of the basis of organizing work. And that'd be interesting maybe to talk about too, the sort of ongoing relationship between scholarship or research and organizing and activism. So, we could really think about socially useful production as in many ways a preamble to the better parts of responsible technology, or calls for a just transition. And an approach, which is, of course, an approach developed by environmental justice groups and labor unions who are rooted in working class BIPOC communities, rather than sort of starting with, corporate leaders in tech who are kind of deciding the terms. And so even within Silicon Valley itself, there is also a history of coalition-based organizing and overlaps between groups that are working for immigrants' rights, labor rights, and environmental justice. And the Silicon Valley of Dreams, which is an amazing book that everybody should read. So Fairchild Semiconductor contaminated the drinking water of South San Jose with a chemical that they used to remove grease from microchips after manufacturing. And this led to community organizing and the formation of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition in the 1980s. The chemicals that were used in electronics manufacturing caused cancer in many of the immigrant women workers and birth defects in their children. So there's also a sort of creepy relationship between Moore's law and the toxicity of chip manufacturing, because the smaller and more powerful the chip, the more toxic it is. And so, Vipra and Myers-West actually point to this problem as they talk about the sort of the AI specialty chips that are needed for sort of scaling AI. And so this is something to definitely think about in our contemporary moment. And what's really interesting as well is that the coalition had a campaign for responsible technology in 1996, and they put forth what they called Silicon Principles that still feel very relevant today. And they included, a health and safety education program. They advocated for working with local communities and workers, doing economic impact assessments of technology, and having R&D policy for civilian, not military needs, global corporate standards, and a life cycle approach to technology production. So it's just amazing how, these conversations that happen both within the activist world and even within sort of the technology world just get totally cast aside and forgotten every few years. So, how do we stop reinventing the wheel and kind of actually have conversations that are grounded in the past, and things that, might actually be useful in today's context. And so I was really struck when Amazon employees for climate justice demanded climate reparations for Pakistan because they were linking catastrophic flooding there to the struggle of Pakistani workers on H-1B visas. And so they very explicitly not only were demanding reparations because of Amazon's sort of outsized environmental impact, given its size, but they also were very explicitly tying precarious workers, particularly from the global south, to environmental destruction. And so thinking about these things in tandem and organizing around it actually did get two of the lead organizers fired. And it is significant that they were really fired not for the climate commitment push, which I think even Amazon could kind of fold back into like net zero promises and kind of make okay again. But for speaking out against the treatment of precarious workers, that's definitely where companies start to get displeased. But what I am kind of heartened by, I guess, is the fact that, within Amazon Employees for Climate Justice, organizers in these sort of more radical groups that are really thinking about justice, a lot of them actually do sort of find each other in employee resource groups. And, it might start with, a conversation about, decarbonization, but then it might end with, a kind of book reading having to do with abolition. And so I think, these places actually do have the capacity to be radicalizing for people, and they are a source of sort of community building within tech. And, I think we've, recently seen a wave of really radical organizing, especially by No Tech for Apartheid. And so, there are tech workers who are willing to kind of work with existing grassroots groups and, work on civil rights issues in tandem with them, and, try to make significant change within the tech industry. And of course, that's also the really important part, is that tech workers have to be learning from and in dialogue with community groups. Like, tech cannot only be talking to itself. And I think that is the thing that is really terrible about the sort of responsible tech landscape, is that it's very, very hard to have a meaningful conversation that sort of is outside of tweaking the tech itself. So, just to kind of think about the way that at Tech Workers Coalition, we were really trying to pull in these sort of understandings of longer tech worker histories, we invited a number of different groups to a teach-in that we held in October of 2022, including people from the Lucas Plan, from Process World, the San Francisco-based zine from the 1980s and 90s, IBM Black Workers Alliance, Computer People for Peace, Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, and National Semiconductor organizers. And we also had, newer waves of organizers there as well. And so, how do you kind of have this sense of continuity? And, how do you sort of begin to have conversations in tech that are more expansive and historically informed? And what's really interesting too is thinking about, different ways that cross supply chain organizing has happened in the past. And so, that was sort of the original impetus for Tech Workers Coalition. It was really about, white collar workers supporting food service workers on tech campuses and kind of getting outside of just their own, day-to-day work experiences. It's sort of beyond the idea of unionization itself too. It is really more about sort of coalition building and solidarity across the supply chain. And as sociologist Nantina Vantas argues, cross-supply chain solidarity is key to climate action and tech in particular. And their work looks at Amazon warehouse workers and Amazon delivery drivers, in addition to white-collar office workers, and really finding the place where you can really build momentum. And that's where the power comes from if you start uniting across the supply chain. And there are continuations of Tech Won't Build It, which was sort of, the early days of Tech Workers Coalition during the AI boom. And I think something that struck me as very interesting is that a Microsoft worker who worked on a sustainability team recently quit his position over the immense carbon footprint of Microsoft's new AI products. And so thinking about sort of refusal and like moments in tech where people might sort of, learn from activists who are already doing the work instead of trying to do it themselves, and including, marginalized perspectives from the start in order to actually change how production happens. And so basically, this is my little spiel that I do at the end of talks where I'm like, academics are always yelled at, within tech companies, especially for not offering solutions. So, this is like, how do we build AI that is actually more responsible, but not techno-solutionist? And I think, as I've mentioned, this idea, I think in addition to sort of looking for full supply chain solidarity and learning from the past and from grassroots organizations, the importance of really considering the full life cycle and keeping that entire supply chain and life cycle in sight, rather than focusing too much on a very specific, kind of fix within the technology itself, and without like focusing on one product, which, like I said, unfortunately is usually the way things go within tech. And so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was amazing. Do we have any questions? I have some questions, but if anyone would like to ask Tamara a question, you can go ahead and raise your Zoom hand, and I will allow you to talk, and you can speak that question out loud. If you'd like to type a question into the Q&A, you can do that also. I guess I'll go ahead and start maybe with a question I always have, and I wonder, yeah, I just want to hear your thoughts about it, which is, the metaphor of the supply chain itself, right? You titled this talk, the AI supply chain. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you didn't come up with that AI supply chain, right? Lots of people have been, describing this AI supply chain, intentionally adopting that language, the metaphor of the supply chain. And, I always wonder why they've done that. And, different people have talked about it in different ways. I told you before, the talk started here that in my class today, we were reading the Witter and Nafis, piece, and they talk about, it makes sense to call it a supply chain because it shares those aspects of, isolated silos where people, are not able to, or it becomes very difficult for people within industry, say, who are working on one particular component to talk to other people. And so it does indeed mirror the abstraction and the sort of siloed, geographies, right? Here, maybe more conceptual geographies than physical ones. But yeah, what do you think about that language of the AI supply chain? Or, I mean, it almost seemed like in your talk, there was maybe a little bit of reclaiming it in a good way, that we can approach it in the way we approach, supply chain problems, right? Trying to think about bringing these geographies together, bringing these different kinds of actors together.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I think the supply chain, the factor that goes into it with AI, I think is the same that happens with any sort of any of the conversations we have about cloud-based technologies. And so, to some extent, yes, we're like, again, showing how this thing that we think is ethereal is actually materially based. And hey, look, like there's all these different parts to it, and we can sort of like, peel back the layers and understand how this stuff works. And that thing that you thought was so magical, well, if you only knew what it really took for it to work its magic, that chatbot is really not, just the chatbot. It's also all these other things. And so I think like that material grounding is useful. And I think especially um, it's something that, and I see Zane is on the call, but like Zane Cooper's work, especially on sort of looking at crypto infrastructures, like this is why it's so important. And Zane, hopefully you'll talk about this at some point in the Q&A, but like, the shift from a lot of crypto infrastructure to becoming like AI, like infrastructure very quickly. And so it's like, hey, we already built this thing, like let's now change to this. Um, so thinking about how, yeah, we're calling attention to the materiality, that's good. But then I think the sort of supply chain from an organizing perspective is really useful in that like the silo aspect within tech is true in that like you really do. I mean, it Intel, it really was like a I mean, I entered the job fully remote as well, which made it much worse. But like, it was very hard to even figure out who you should be talking to. It
Mhm.
is incredibly
Mhm.
difficult to navigate. Just the org chart, all of it is incredibly difficult to decipher. And so the idea that you would even be able to connect to people who were working in the fab, I mean, that was not easy to do from a sort of remote work perspective. And so what does it mean to kind of think across the supply chain? What does it mean like to try to reach out to workers in different parts of the supply chain? Um, I think that can be useful for people who are maybe only thinking about the 40 or 50 people that they encounter in like Teams meetings on a regular basis.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Or I can keep going. I'm totally happy to keep going. Um, I just want to pause slightly. Well, I mean, you started to get there also in terms of, where you ended your talk and, where you ended this response just now in terms of thinking about the organizing, right? Thinking about like, what we do and how hard it is to get in touch with people or know who to get in touch with, or which is common to other supply chain problems, right? Like if only we could access this one person who works at this one supplier in this one country that speaks a different language than us, we could get a lot of useful leverage into unpacking some critical labor problem or some critical environmental problem in this supply chain. um is it is it just a sort of coalition of the willing and then sort of building that out, finding the tech workers who are interested in communities, who are, willing to meet with people in communities who are doing community organizing, and then trying to leverage them and their sort of place in the org chart to kind of build up these networks. And then, if that is the case, like, what do you do with the realities of the industry when, yeah, everybody gets fired, and all of a sudden all those maybe useful allies are just not there anymore, right? And I'm also, I'm also aware that they're, the people who were harvested, I guess, in the last calling tended to have that more sort of outsidery position, right? They were the people who were approaching this maybe from that sort of perpetual outsider perspective. But if you could build up a coalition inside, there's even still the risk that those people just disappear when the next round of layoffs or a pivot occurs in industry.
Yeah, that is definitely the kind of ongoing problem. I mean, I think that is why the like rather than just sort of organizing within one's own workplace across the supply chain, I think that is why you need these larger movements that kind of are more of a cross-industry collection of people, so that, when you do get laid off, your your networks don't all disappear. Or like, because if you're kind of only talking to people within your own organization, then all of the organizing efforts that you were making are also kind of going to disappear if that was your entire focus. So, um, but I guess I would also note that I've known people in many cases who have left particular companies either because of a layoff or because they quit, who are still very much involved with organizing happening within their old um, company. So I think it also does depend on sort of the kind of work that people are doing. Um, but the other interesting part of it maybe is sort of the cycles of burnout and also newer generations of organizers appearing. So I think there's been a tendency to kind of think of the tech worker movement as being over, and maybe the mass layoffs were the death knell. Like now everybody's too depressed and scared about getting laid off to do anything. And I think maybe there was some hope that the mass layoffs would be a kind of catalyzing moment, but they really haven't been in that way. But the tech worker movement has just shifted into other areas. And so I've noticed that, in terms of people in the Bay Area, kind of who were actively involved with Tech Workers Coalition in the past, I mean, a lot of energy is now going towards no tech for apartheid. And so you have, different sort of issues that come up and political moments that come up. And so the energy just kind of shifts in a different direction. But it is interesting that the vast majority of people I knew who were kind of in sustainability roles in a lot of the big companies are now out, with a little green banner on LinkedIn. And so um, thinking about what that means in terms of people who were trying to kind of build up a core of support internally for sustainability initiatives, I think it does show you like the limits of what you can do internally. Like so if we're gonna have like a, reform or revolution conversation, yeah, I'd say like you need people inside. You do need people inside, but the real change is not going to come internally.
Mhm. There's a question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee, which I'll go ahead and read. This person asks, building upon the connection you drew between the histories of coalition building and, I believe, informing useful production, can you unpack why forging this connection is important to your work and to the broader field of HCI and STS?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I would say that, the reason that I care about history is that, I do anyway, right? Like that's part of just the kind of work that I do. But I also think that when you are looking at something that appears to be changing very rapidly, it is important to keep perspective. And so that, I mean, I don't really want to talk about my book right now, but when you're studying stuff that only happens online, particularly only on social media, you need to figure out how to document it and preserve it. And you kind of need to be able to remember what happened, like 2 years ago on a particular platform, or 5 or 10 years. And being able to kind of think about how particular experiences of technology change over time is a really critical part of really being able to understand the relationships between people and institutions and the technology itself. And so how do you understand power without kind of noticing how things change or don't change over time? Um, and so that, I'd say that just on a practical level as well, um, I think it's very helpful in a sort of um, HCI context where, often there's a kind of focus on whatever the newest technology is, right? Or like whatever, now, I mean, if I'm, say, reviewing for a sort of big HCI conference right now, I might notice that there are a lot of titles that have to do with like generative AI, right? Um, but what, like, we can't just always be racing towards the newest thing. We have to also try to situate everything, and sadly, like in terms of like web history and history within the context of things like the tech industry, history is like 5 years ago, and so I think being able to kind of maintain that connection to even like the not very distant past is incredibly important, rather than thinking that everything is brand new, because there are many things that are happening right now that are actually not brand new. And that's exactly why, the sort of anti-apartheid tech protesters today are looking to the history of, Polaroid workers advocating for anti-apartheid organizing in South Africa. So um, it's like a direct relationship.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Anybody else? I can ask one final question, but I'll also just say, yeah, your answer to this anonymous attendee, yeah, also resonates with that sort of, shifting, from one, internal organizing effort to another as the sort of politics or the needs of the political moment change. I guess there's not really a question because I think we all know what the answer is. It's just how do we think about the answer, which is how do we crystallize that moment into something like legislation or policy or a way to preserve those conversations in a way that that has a lasting impact is very difficult, right? And um, it's something that we also struggle with in sort of conventionally physical supply chain stories too, right? How do we crystallize these moments of change? um, but my final question, unless anybody else has any other questions, this is your last chance. So my final question is a softball question for you. What does a just AI supply chain look like in your mind?
Honestly,
A no
um,
AI supply chain?
yeah, I mean, well, it's very hard to imagine what a just AI supply chain would be like just because of what we're working with, I think.
Mhm.
Thinking about sort of what it would actually mean to um, undo the different power structures that are sort of undergirding all of AI production. Uh, so basically, yeah, you would have to overthrow capitalism, and then maybe from there we could figure something out.
Yeah, during your talk, I was thinking about, the real sort of Ouroboros, of it all, which is that, as maybe when we have, Miriam Posner here, in a month or so, she'll talk about how AI is being used in, sort of the management of supply chains. So we have this system which is built on these world-spanning supply chains with all the materiality, toxic chemicals, environmental impacts, questionable, labor practices. And we, and then the energy use that the AI layer consumes now feeding back into those underlying supply chains, just eating itself, again and again. It is hard to think about the unraveling.
Well, actually, and I wonder, I'm really excited for Miriam's talk, and yeah, I was going to actually say something about like seeing like a supply chain, which is such a good
Yeah,
title. Um,
it
but
is.
um, yeah, the whole like supply chain transparency thing. So like, yeah, AI can be used for that. You know what else was being thrown around as like a really good way to do supply chain transparency to make sure it was more ethical. Oh, I know, blockchain. Like, I mean, it's just like, yeah. So basically it's just, yeah, another form of techno-solutionism. Um, but I think, it just becomes this whole sort of problem with optimization. It's just a different form of optimization, like ethics as optimization in any sense. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tamara. I hope everyone will join me in giving you a virtual round of applause here for your wonderful talk. And are you asking a question, Amy, or is that um, your are you
oh,
asking a question,
I think it's a question.
or was
Maybe.
it a round of applause? I'll take it as a round of applause. So thank you so much, Tamara, and thank you everyone who was able to attend. Like I said, if it's okay with Tamara, we will go ahead and share the Zoom recording for people who were unable to attend. And I'd like to remind you that our next event will be Thursday, February 8th at noon. That's to accommodate the European time zone difficulties. Amy says it was applause, no worries. And on February 8th at noon, we'll be hosting Jess Beer and Jessica Steinman from Erasmus University Rotterdam, which I'm really looking forward to, as well as the rest of the events. And I hope to see some of you there. So again, thank you so much.